to read it out, or I can just give it to you. It details exactly the process for the T12, which are the ladies and gentlemen that will get their money back arising from the legislation that we're going to pass. Really briefly, we're in the process of recruiting. We need extra staff in one of our offices to look after all of these new applications. That recruitment is going to be finished by the end of this month. So in early October, having recruited the additional temporary resources, we're going to in-house examine 76,000 individual social insurance records, and we'll begin that, and that's going to take a couple of months. At the end of that process, what we'll be able to do to each of those individual 67,000 people to say is, on the old system you got €10. On the new system, you are entitled to €12. You choose. And so your concern, and that's been raised on behalf of people who've obviously spoken to you about, is that somebody might lose out on this, won't come to reality, because the person will decide whether they stay on the 10 or move to the 11. So anybody who's on 10 and gets moved to 9 will obviously get to stay on the 10 if they want to. So nobody will lose out because of the changes that we're making. People will only opt, obviously, to an increased payment. They're certainly not going to opt to a decreased payment. And also to tell you that initially, I would have thought that we would have introduced the legislation that's required to fix this anomaly in the Social Welfare Bill. It may not be part of the Social Welfare Bill. It may be easier to do it as a standalone, but we're currently just deliberating that. But either way, that piece of that either small amendment to the Social Welfare Bill or a small standalone bill will be introduced between now and the end of the year to ensure that we get ready to start making those payments at the beginning of next year and backdate them to March of this year. But I give you, this is a 3-page just little explainer line by line, right, and I'll get a copy of it to you later on just so that you can have it for your own records.
You might circulate that to all the committee. Of
course, that's no problem at all. Yep, no problem at all. It's just the timelines around the T12 project, so it's, I might have said them already, but just to give them to you in written form. So just to answer you, the audit hasn't been conducted with regard to that because there is no need. I'm making the assumption that nobody is going to choose to be on a lesser payment than they're currently on. People will only opt to go on to a more positive payment, and therefore there will be only a positive impact onto it. You mentioned about the imbalance that exists on the basis of private pensioners obviously being able to avail of tax relief to the tune of €2.6 billion. How I'm going to address that imbalance is by introducing automatic enrolment. And the strawman is out for proposal. Again, it has a proposal 6, 6 and 2, which would give you a 33% incentive as opposed to a 20% or a 40% incentive, which is currently existing in the private pension scheme. But again, it's not an end game. It hasn't been determined or decided what that actual system is going to look like, and when we finish the public consultation at the end of November, I think we collectively decide together what that new pension system and that savings scheme is going to look like for the future pensioners of Ireland. And it's the only way I have addressing the imbalance, because there's 65% of people currently working in Ireland who will have no income other than the state pension when they reach 66 or 67, depending on when they retire. And whilst we've agreed in the pensions roadmap that that pension will never drop below 34% of the average mean income in Ireland, what I do know is that people who haven't planned for their pension and only have that, in a lot of cases, find a huge cliff of earnings and drop of earnings of what they have enjoyed over their working career to what they might enjoy in pensionable ages if they haven't put aside some other form of savings. And so that's how we're going to address that imbalance. I actually completely agree with you with regard to what we could expect as unforeseen weather, extreme weather incidents. And they're nearly not unforeseen anymore, because I think we're all expecting them. There is a definite shift and a change in climate patterns in this country, and I think we have to acknowledge and prepare for it. But that's probably about as much as I can say to you, given the context of the discussions that we're having. But I am well aware, and I actually agree with you, and I think you're accurate, that we are and should be preparing for other extreme weather events, and particularly vulnerable people who have to think outside of the box when those affect, as opposed to other households. The 40,000 new jobs in the last year is actually not a true reflection of the number of jobs that were created. So although the live register has dropped by 40,000 people from this time last year to now, there's actually been 74,000 new jobs created. And so obviously one can assume that either some people are returning to Ireland, which is great. And some people may not have been on the live register. They might have been a qualified adult, or they might have, been in college or whatever, are taking up those new jobs. Our job is to make sure that the employment rights legislation that we've passed through the House goes to the Shannon and gets passed as quickly as we can, notwithstanding obviously the body of work that has to be done for the self-employed contractors business, to make sure that those rights are enshrined, so that low pay, low hours, precarious nature of work doesn't allow to be flaunted by the very small number of employers that we know that do it. But in the main, the people who are directly impacted on it are the people who are working on minimum wage, who are in the most precarious positions in their life, in their economic life, for want of a better word, during using or partaking in those kind of jobs. Once that legislation is passed, in the vast majority of cases, 0-hour contracts will be banned. We'll have the bans of dedicated contract hours that people will have to be put on, reflecting the actuality of their services for the previous 18 months. All of that will come into play as soon as we pass the legislation, and I hope it's sooner rather than later. But just to acknowledge, there are far more jobs being created, and the IDA and the CSO would tell us that they are good quality paying jobs, not in the main in the low-paid sector that you're talking about. But we do need that legislation to ensure that people who are working minimum wage not only get the supports from the state that we can offer from the Department of Social Welfare, but also the employment rights that's equal to the likes of working for a large multinational or a large Irish corporation. I don't have the exact numbers, but this is just a recall from a meeting that I had this morning. You're under the impression, and we'll get you the numbers so that I can prove it's not anecdotal, that people who apply for carers allowance are told no so that they have to appeal. There's only 1% of the applications that are made are actually appealed. It's a tiny amount of people that actually have to appeal. Now, I confirm that, so that's only, don't take that as gospel, that's only a recollection.
My clinic, so every single one of them must be coming into Ballyfermot Clinic.
We do acknowledge that the 18 weeks is too long. And I also acknowledge that when you do appeal, you may be waiting another 12, 14, 16 weeks, but it's because of the complexity of the application in the first instance. And that's why not only do we move staff around to try and reduce those working weeks turnaround, but also we're going to improve the application process to make it easier for people to give more accurate information in the first instance, in the same way as we did with the DCA allowance. And maybe, are you giving me more accurate information here?
That's just about the new form.
Sorry, the changing of the form for DCA made a huge impact. We're going to do the same for carers.
Okay, just on that, if you're giving me the figures for the numbers that appeal, could you give me the figures for the percentage that's refused?
Sure.
Please.
Yeah, of course, that's no problem at all. And lastly, but not leastly, again, thank you for, first of all, acknowledging and recognising that we're unravelling the cuts that were made. I totally and I'm well aware that if I was to unravel them, it would need to bring them back up to 146, would be the equivalent of what they were. As I said to you, it would be probably premature of me to say anything, given that I'm in negotiations for the budget at the moment, but I think you know where my head is at with relation to that, and I will keep working on it. As I mentioned to Deputy Brady earlier on, children's allowance is a universal payment. If we were to change children's allowance to extend it to people who are in full-time primary education until, regardless of their age, until they do their leaving cert, there would be, first of all, a sizable amount of money associated with that. But second of all, it wouldn't it would cost serious money. It's tens of millions. It's not small beans. Like, it would cost tens of millions to ensure that everybody who stays in school till their leaving cert, regardless of their age, got a children's allowance payment. It would increase that expenditure by tens of millions. But you rightly point out that if my kids were 18 and still in school, I shouldn't get that extension. And so when I target, you asked me if we could find a way of means testing for the most vulnerable of families who need that money. The means testing is the qualified child payment that's made on a weekly basis to people who have no other income outside of what they get from the state's supports or their part-time jobs, whether they're working in working family payments or not. That's the way we have as a state of increasing and targeting the money that we have to make sure that those families who need it most get it, not by extending a universal payment to people who might not need it, just for the sake of keeping the universality of the payment. That's only my opinion. That's just the way I feel. I think we have too many children living in consistent poverty. When I look, disappointingly, and again, this is probably my own naivety, when I look at the changes that we made to last year's budget, and I know they were only tiny, but they only had an impact of bringing 0.3% of the children who are living in poverty out of poverty. That tells me that we need billions of euros in direct transfers to bring the other 8.2% of children who are living in consistent poverty out of poverty. And I don't think the state's money is best spent by giving it to people who don't necessarily need it. I think we should support the people targetedly who do need it, and that's why I would disagree with increasing the universal payment for everybody in school. And I think, Chair, that wraps me up. I think.
Thanks very much. I know a lot of ground is covered. I just want to bring in Deputy Brady after I